Welcome to CinemaScope. I'm Andy Nelson. Each episode, I'm joined by a guest to map one genre, subgenre, or film movement, what defines it, what shaped it, and what it influenced. Today, we're diving into 1950s science fiction, a decade where alien visitors, mutations, and world-ending threats weren't just popcorn thrills. They became a kind of cultural pressure valve for the atomic age, the Cold War, and a rapidly changing sense of what the future could mean. As we go, we'll use a practical viewing lens for the era, what fears these films externalize, what they suggest about the body and identity, and how their visions of science and authority reflect the moment they were made. Joining me today is critic Robert Horton, a member of the National Society of Film Critics and the Critics' Choice Awards, and host of The Music and the Movies. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hello, Andy. Nice to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you for this discussion. It's going to be a lot of fun movies to talk about and to watch for sure. And it was, it's fair to say it was hard to narrow our list down because there are really so many fun options that we could have picked.
That's right. Yeah, anybody watching can take these as these just happen to be the ones that we settle on. You could absolutely spread this out over at least a dozen other titles, I suppose.
Absolutely. Well, before we dig in, Robert, though, I would love to get a sense of your background in science fiction. Like, what first pulled you toward science fiction? And I guess as an add-on to that, does this era, this 1950s era, have any particular hold for you?
Yes, it does. I think I don't think of myself as being a science fiction specialist or anything like that. It's just something that I really like in the realm of being a film critic. I've grew up during an era where there were late night movie hosts who would show horror films, and in Seattle, that was a thing called Nightmare Theater on Friday nights. And so a lot of the, not only science fiction films, but science fiction films of the 1950s sort of churned through that roster regularly. So I guess I was very taken with them early on, and they stayed with me. I got to, later in life, got to teach science fiction a little bit. I taught a science fiction class at Seattle University once, and for Scarecrow Video, which is in Seattle, and for whom I do some educational outreach things. And so science fiction just keeps coming around, and it is a great era. I do have a feeling that that, if you look at the history of science fiction and film, there is not that much really until you get to the dawn of the 1950s, and we can go into the reasons for that.
Sure. Yeah,
but other than, like Flash Gordon serials and the occasional one-off, it wasn't like it is today, where if you feel like, I'd really like to see a science fiction film, there will be, if you're the kind of person who actually still goes to theaters, there will be one playing in the theater, and certainly and something new each week on streaming or whatever.
Sure, yeah.
But the 50s, it's not only a really cool era for movie making, but it is kind of when the science fiction film blossomed, came into its own.
That's a good way of describing it for sure. Well, for this episode, we're going to look at a core set of films on the main show. And then for members, we are going to go a little deeper with a few more titles, as usual. On the main show, we're going to be talking about The Thing from Another World from 1951, The Day the Earth Stood Still, also from 1951, Godzilla from 1954, Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956, and The Incredible Shrinking Man from 1957. And for members, we are also going to dig into Forbidden Planet from 1956, Not of This Earth from 1957, I Married a Monster from Outer Space from 1958, best title on the list for sure, The Fly from 1958, and The World, the Flesh, and the Devil from 1959. If you'd like to access the member bonus content, you can join for $5 a month or $55 a year. Just head to truestory.fm/join to learn more. All right, we're going to be right back, and then we're going to set the stage for why 1950s sci-fi matters. So in our last episode, we talked about post-war Westerns and how World War II and everything that followed reshaped the stories that American movies were telling about community, violence, and moral certainty. And it got me thinking, it might be interesting to spend a little time with genres that were directly impacted by the same historical aftershock, because even when the setting shifts, all of those anxieties are still there, right? And for me, 1950s science fiction really feels like the clearest example. After the war, you've got the atomic age, the Cold War, technology goes crazy, and suddenly it's not just something that's out there, right? It's in the sky, it's in labs, it's in your body, it's in your neighbor, it's your own sense of identity, it's all of these things. And these films turn that pressure into images. We've got invasion, mutation, annihilation, transformation, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as wish fulfillment, sometimes it's just paranoia. So why is the 1950s science fiction kind of move, or we'll call it a cycle, such an important era to understand, either for, I guess, the DNA of the genre or for what it reveals about the post-war world? And let's try to keep it big picture for now, because we're going to get into a lot more specifics later.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is you've made a good big picture introduction to it, and the way that the shock of the war and its aftermath allowed Westerns to become more complicated, allowed film noir to bloom, which is very anxious style in American film. And the other thing, along with all of those kind of free-floating changes and anxieties, science fiction benefits, if that's the right word, from, as you said, the atomic age, which launches in 1945. They sort of bookended on the other side by, I suppose you could say, the launch of Sputnik, as we get toward the end of the 1950s, and there's just all this stuff going on, all these new things. 1947 brought about the first real flying saucer sighting. It happened up near where I live, near Mount Rainier. A guy saw some things, and yeah, he actually coined the phrase. He said they kind of looked like if you took a saucer and skipped it across the water. He was a pilot in a single engine, and so overnight that phrase "flying saucers" just went into the lexicon immediately, and Hollywood was soon to follow.
Yeah,
but
right.
all those reasons, and then there's also the interesting phenomenon of the baby boom. I've read somewhere a long time ago that the idea of youth culture didn't even exist before the 1950s. It just wasn't a thing. But with the baby boom, you had this giant bubble of young people, and they wanted certain kinds of movies, and they even wanted certain kinds of movie theaters, because this was the age when the drive-in theater had its heyday from the end of the Second World War into the 1960s. And it was a lot of teenagers going to those too, and needing a certain kind of movie to fill all those screens. And so it was a pretty good confluence of effects. And as you said, we will get into some of the specifics of why flying saucer movies, why monster movies, and so on. But the stage was definitely set, and it was a science fiction at the movies. It existed before that in pulp magazines and everything, but it was really kind of waiting for the post-war era to take off.
Well, and I'm glad that you kind of ended with that, because I now want to kind of use that and rewind a little bit so that we can figure out why, like how we got here. So, because when we say 1950s science fiction, we're not talking about science fiction appearing out of nowhere. It didn't just happen suddenly. And you've already mentioned there had been other elements, just not much. But there was kind of a pipeline. There was some literary science fiction. There had been radio shows. Orson Welles' War of the Worlds is probably the most famous leading up to this. Comics and a lot of other, I guess there's DNA that we've seen through the 30s and 40s, even into some of the silent films, you could say. You can look at horror movies, mad scientist films, even some wartime propaganda films could potentially show some new technologies, enemies you can't see, things like that. But World War II really did kind of create this shift. I mean, the bomb was a huge change, really changed what science meant in the public imagination, right? I mean, all the kids were watching, duck and cover films in classrooms. And so it was this huge change in everything. And it was miraculous, but it was also terrifying. And it changes what a threat means. It's like this big existential sort of thing now. There's ideologies, and it could be hiding in plain sight. All of that, I think, is kind of like this shift. And so I'm trying to get a sense, like, what are the, I guess we'll say, the biggest feeders that got us to this point? Was it comics? Where did it kind of come from?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, this idea of the threat changing, I like what you're saying, because you could say that in horror movies like Frankenstein or Mad Scientist films, the idea was that there was a certain kind of science that man was not meant to meddle with. This was always the conclusion of those movies, and that meant on a fairly personal, intimate level. But with the bomb, that changes everything to a global level, and to the possibility of actual annihilation of the planet. And so all of a sudden, the stakes are completely different. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that science fiction was a disreputable genre. It was not something that a major studio would really want to dabble in. There were occasional, there's a interesting British film called Things to Come from the 1930s that is, you can kind of get away with it if it's based on an H.G. Wells novel or something, that is kind of respectable like that. And so and Jules Verne, one of the most famous silent films is Voyage to the Moon, one of the first really great narrative movies. So those are some of the building blocks, but I have the feeling that it was, it was science catching up and being supercharged by these crazy coincidences. Maybe they're not coincidences, but of the atomic program and this possibility that aliens might actually be visiting us, that supercharged the whole thing. And it's that's the only thing I can think of for actually not even answering the question of why did this have such a boom in the 50s, but why didn't it catch on before that? What was it was clear that if you went to a Flash Gordon serial, these things that are an ancient form of A Night at the Movies, where people would go for 12 weeks in a row and you'd see one chapter, right? In the pre-TV era, they were always cheap and they were generally bad, and they were mostly for kids. And so there was nothing that came along to suggest that a good director might want to work on this, or that even a prestigious studio like MGM or something. And all of that changes in the 1950s, even though we still have wonderful kind of cheesy exploitation B movies going on in the science fiction realm. You do have you do have the MGM makes Forbidden Planet and other instances of that.
Yeah, you're right. Day of the Earth is still with Robert Wise at the
Yeah,
helm.
yeah.
Well, so that's an interesting point that you made, and I think there's something to be said about how perhaps before the bomb was dropped and the world stage was reset as far as how things came out of World War II, with kind of like the birth of the Cold War and kind of that rift, and how science and government kind of like ended up having kind of new roles for what we were seeing. I wonder if it's almost like you could say it grew up in some capacity, and it seemed like, adults, like there's stuff that adults would enjoy with these stories too, because it's not just something that's for kids. Like there's some serious nature to these tales and what we can get out of it by kind of showing all of this in a more serious, and I know it's not always serious, these movies we're talking about, but more serious than the Flash Gordon serials for sure.
Yeah. All of those issues that would later be such a big part of Star Trek and other science fiction TV series and so on, they do all seem to get laid out really quickly in some of the earliest films of the 1950s. And suddenly it's not just, wouldn't time travel be cool? It's what does it mean to be human? What are our ethical responsibilities in our world and even other worlds? How does the heaviness of science, which after 1945 is really heavy, how does that impact our lives and the way we live our lives? And all that stuff could suddenly be taken up by through the vessel of science fiction. And you mentioned the Cold War, and this is what popular culture does. It becomes this place where we work out anxieties and fears and hopes in sometimes allegorical ways and sometimes barely disguised ways, as we will see. And there was science fiction was waiting for that. I mean, the Western does the same thing, but here was
Right,
science
yeah.
fiction kind of coming along and in its era.
Well, and I think it's interesting because when you look at the way that this just, I mean, it had a huge boom in the 50s. It's not, I mean, you'd mentioned like we have science fiction, it's a pretty regular occurrence now, but in the 50s, it seemed like it was an explosion, really. Like, I mean, with the birth of the drive-ins you mentioned, which, then there also were the double bills, and the fact that you would throw two of these science fiction movies back to back and like everyone would go and watch them, and all these, the 50s also came out of the war with kind of the birth of these, as you said, kind of that youth culture, and they were going to a lot of this stuff. Plus you have the TV being born and like the TV culture, and by the end of this decade, Twilight Zone is going to be a regular show that people are watching. And so there's a lot of these things, and I think that pairs also with some of these studios, especially some of the like the Poverty Row studios with lower budgets and faster production cycles, really cranking these things out to try to get more people to watch all of these.
Yeah. And there's one other thing that to add to what you're saying, which is it's the scale of storytelling, which is if we're now in an era where all of humanity could be wiped out overnight, or we can destroy our planet or maybe other planets, we need a storytelling form that could contain that. And science fiction lets you do that. It has a largeness to it. It has a gigantic imagination, sometimes an outlandishness, and the Western can't really contain that. So we need to shift into something else, and maybe that fits into why sci-fi can do the work, can do the heavy lifting.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because even with some lower budgets, you can still get away with some larger scope stories, right? In the scope of science fiction, you can get away with some of that.
One of the ones that we're not officially talking about is a movie called Earth versus the Flying Saucers from '57 or so, and that's not a very good movie. But if you're a fan of the special effects genius Ray Harryhausen, it's got some of his stuff, and that's one of those that it's just blowing up the Washington monuments, where we're gonna get the White House, we're gonna get the Washington Monument, where the aliens are going to take care of all that. And all that was done on a low budget too. So you're absolutely right. It's with special effects and with sci-fi, you can really work things out on that huge scale.
Absolutely. So I like to talk about like where things fit on what I call the cinematic family tree. And kind of with everything we've been talking about, where would you say that the 50s sci-fi fits in kind of the genre family tree? I mean, obviously science fiction, but I mean, I feel like there have to be threads pulling in from horror, from war movies, and like those sorts of elements too, to kind of give it its own special feel, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I'm trying to think, I mean, for one thing, for instance, some of the myths and the mythologies that are at play in the Western get very easily adopted for science fiction. You could even argue with the rise of Star Wars and others at the end of the 1970s and the death of the Western, basically in the early to mid 1970s, that science fiction took on a lot of those mythologies and just ran
the new
with
frontier.
Yeah, because we didn't believe in the Western anymore. But the new frontier, what an apt coinage for President Kennedy there.
Yeah, right.
And then we see that you can look and see how The Day the Earth Stood Still, for instance, carries vestiges of film noir. It certainly looks like a film noir, and the director Robert Wise had done some noir movies before that. So does it fit in? Yeah, it does change too. The 50s cycle, the one that those of us who like talking about this, who feel that it does reflect the Cold War anxieties, and that the aliens in some cases stand in for the commies or whatever. It is kind of nice that you can point to a kind of rounding off of it from 1950 or so until, I don't know, the early 60s. Probably we get into sci-fi, loses a little bit, and then 2001: A Space Odyssey comes along in 1968, and all that that changes everything. But it is it's kind of cool that like film noir, although science fiction continues, there's also this classic period, and it is kind of contained, and it does line up with very interesting historical things that are going on in the world and in the United States. And so, Family Tree. I mean, I think it has a really, really interesting limb for sure.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because I mean, thinking of like I mentioned horror and war movies, but you can also, like we already mentioned, like the mad scientist types of horror films, like that definitely threads into here as well. And you just mentioned film noir, like you can definitely get a tinge of that noir, kind of the suspicion, the infiltration, like those sorts of stories in noir that can fall into this. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and the thing from Another World is a kind of platoon movie in a way. It descends from the war film.
Yeah.
The director Howard Hawks had made some war movies along with every other imaginable genre, but it has the quality of a group of people working together fighting the enemy. So it's definitely got that energy going on in it.
Yeah. Within this branch on the cinematic family tree, what how would you, like, how many twigs, I guess we'll call them, would you say spin off of like 1950s sci-fi? Like if you were going to call like Alien Contact or Alien Invasion one branch, right? Like what other stories are like the most prevalent ones that we're seeing in the 50s?
Yeah, well, what do we got? We've got the direct atomic nuclear manifestation, where we have movies about mutations and monsters, and it is directly connected to that.
Yep.
You have more of a hard sci-fi thing where, like Forbidden Planet, you go to another world and you create that world, and so it's not about invaders. It's in some ways, some of those movies are a more hopeful kind of vision of what mankind is capable of and what can do.
Yeah. And that one also has a bit of the mad scientist sort of element, or scientist as God sort of.
Definitely does.
Yeah.
That's what's fun about it. There's the old standby of the natural world that revolts. That maybe that's kind of a gray area where the disaster movie leaves off and where sci-fi begins. But the movie When Worlds Collide from 1951 is a great one where a planet gets off its axis and it's going to hit the Earth. So science must leap to the fore and try to figure out some possible answers for that. So I think there are a few of those kinds of things in our list.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, we kind of have covered this a little bit with like mutation, but like less about the monsters and more about ourselves. But like with The Incredible Shrinking Man and The Fly, there's definitely a sense of like, what have we done to ourselves, and kind of like the transformation of our identity, ourselves.
Yeah, that's always a good one, and invariably there it's kind of interesting that those movies about scientists who get ahead of themselves, they do always seem to get kind of smacked down a little bit. They have to learn that it's a lesson of hubris. It's like, we like science, but let's
slow your roll a little bit.
Look what happened with that Oppenheimer chap, and he was great, but now we got to deal with this. That's another good one for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting to look at, like, I mean, I know we're talking about the 50s, but even within the 50s, do you see changes within kind of the flow of the decade versus like what was in the early decade versus the late decade?
I don't know, because you've got the interesting dichotomy between two movies that we're going to talk about, Day the Earth Stood Still and The Thing from Another World, which came out within a couple of months of each other in 51, is The Thing presents a monster that's completely malevolent. The Day the Earth Stood Still has a benign emissary who has a threat, but is also spreading a message of peace. And so I'm thinking about the changes in that, because mostly the decade seems to get more paranoid as it goes along. It aligns itself more with the, it's a threat. And I could be just talking off the top of my head here, but you almost have to get to, I know there are exceptions, but by the time you get to Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the late 70s, and then E.T. A few years later, you finally return to the idea that maybe the aliens are just curious. Maybe they want to make friends. Maybe they're actually nice. But the sort of the worry, the anxiety takes over a little bit during the course of the 50s.
Yeah, that was kind of my read as I looked at these films and just was thinking about it a little bit. It definitely felt like over the course of it, the paranoia really just kind of continues kicking in. And I don't know if that was just a drive from like the Cold War and just kind of all of that paranoia, but also it felt like the paranoia with science in general. Like in the beginning, we have, it feels like there's a little more sense of, we can, we're leaders, we can kind of work to contain all of this. But then by the time you get to the end, it felt like it was much less containable. And that was just kind of like how I was reading it as I was watching these. And I know there's probably, like we said, there's so many other films that we could take into account to look at this, but just from these films, that was the read that I had on it.
Yeah, that there might be some truth in that, because you think of America coming out of World War II and feeling triumphant, and by the end of the decade here, the Cold War is just dragging on.
Yeah.
And we don't seem to be winning it, although it was pretty much a boom era for prosperity in the United States. And there's the other thing that starts to get interesting, especially toward the end of the decade, and that is, we're talking about science fiction as a vessel for dealing with different topics, and there's this idea that the 50s was a kind of a conformist decade, and that a lot of people felt pressure to be socially similar and so on. And you see this in a lot of Hollywood movies, but science fiction becomes a form where you can deal with that, where you can talk about that idea. And so we do have some films toward the end of the decade that start to get into that with a sci-fi apparatus around it. And you mentioned The Twilight Zone, which does the same thing. Many of its episodes are about a kind of smothering society in which it sometimes feels like everybody is being forced to think the same way or whatever. And that was certainly a big concern of Rod Serling when he would, and he, as he said, the way you could deal with that in a slightly disguised way was science fiction or fantasy, and you could score your points without having the network censors come down on you for saying something critical about American society or whatever the threat might have been. So sci-fi, and we'll talk a little bit about that in some of our choices, but sci-fi does allow you to do that too, and maybe that pressure of a conformist society starts to build toward the end of the 50s, I think.
Yeah, I definitely feel like that's the case, and which is interesting because then you look at where that pushes American culture the next decade, and you can really see that rebellion as we get to the end of the 60s and how so many people were pushing against that conformity that was really kind of starting at this point in time. All right, well, let's start walking through the films, and let's just kind of talk through all these different points. We're looking at like what fear or pressure is the movie externalizing? What is it suggesting about body and identity? What does it assume about science and authority? And we'll see kind of where we go with each of these. After the break, we're going to take a quick break, and then after the break, we're going to start the films in order with The Thing from Another World. Okay, we are kicking off in 1951 with The Thing from Another World. directed by Christian Nyby, although I've always heard people say Howard Hawks directed this. So that's an interesting point that maybe we can have an asterisk on as part of the conversation. This is a tight procedural siege film. A team at an Arctic outpost recovers a mysterious craft from the ice, and what comes with it turns the station into a pressure cooker where military pragmatism and scientific curiosity collide. Funny enough, as many times as I've seen John Carpenter's The Thing, this was my first time watching this film, and I had a great time with it. This is an interesting one because where would you say in the film's worldview, who should be in charge when the unknown arrives? Is it the scientists or is it the military?
Yeah, this is one of those interesting things about this movie is we want to come down on the side of the rationalists, although in this case they seem to be kind of not quite in touch with reality. The scientists come off rather badly in this one. It's interesting. The scientists are the group that wants to keep the thing alive and study it. This is the greatest scientific discovery ever when this thing crash lands in the ice. And everybody else is afraid that they're going to get killed, which turns out to be true.
Fair thing.
It is going to not only kill them, but it's going to replicate itself all over the planet and destroy us all if it can. So the regular folks turn out to be right in this case. But I think the thing that I like about it is, weirdly enough, and I love the film. What it presents to you, this movie, it's a very talky movie. It's full of conversation. All of it quite interesting. And the way I think of it is it presents a vision of humanity that is the justification for saving humanity. The thing, which is alone in the spaceship that crashes, is just pure malevolence. It's violence. It cannot be reasoned with, and it just wants to do this evolutionary thing and take over everybody and take over the planet. And humans are actually able to talk to each other, listen to each other, confront each other, make jokes with each other, work out solutions. There's all this dialogue about, how are we going to do this? What if this would work? And somebody else says, well, you could do this. And those kinds of things, this is actually very typical of the films of Howard Hawks, who often made movies about groups of people who were, this is only science fiction film, but about groups of people who were trying to solve problems or get something done. And that, I actually really like that vision of humanity. We are cooperative. We are talkative. We are reasoning, actually, even if the scientists are a little kooky in this version, and that's what saves us. And it's also the thing that makes us worth saving. It is that I think you can go in a direct line almost from this movie to countless Star Trek episodes. Debate what is human. Why are we worth saving? Oh yes, we can do this. We can solve problems, and that's what I kind of love most about it. I mean, it's got a great monster, of course, but it is that's what I always think of when I think of this film.
Well, it's interesting because there's this sense of this creature as, it's not here for, as you said, for any good reasons, but it's also, I don't know, is it just in its own sense a force of nature? Is it just, it's just like a seed pod, right, that we'll talk about in other films. It's just here, because it grows, it's kind of a plant creature, I guess is what it is.
Right.
Is it just growing and that it's doing what it does? Like, that's all it knows, is it needs to get to a place and then and take over. So it seems malevolent to us because the goal is to destroy us, to like feed on, the planet and kind of like take over everything. So is it just a force of nature? Is it actually an invader? Is it more, should we look at it like a contagion? And I think that's what I think is so interesting about the film. And just another point going back to what you were saying about kind of like the cooperative nature of it, that I really appreciated the fact that the reporter is included in on everything. And I'm like, well, that's just something that would never happen these days. Like, just bring the reporter along so he can be here in case there's a story.
Yeah, right. And it is a strong, and this is also true of Hawks's films. There's a strong sense of community that springs up, and he even the look of the film. There's so many group scenes where people are crowded together in rooms and within the shot, and that reinforces that idea. But yeah, no, the thing is just doing what it's doing. It is a vegetable of some sort, and the scientists realize that. But so we can't ascribe any motives other than self-replication to it. But we are in the way. If we hadn't if we hadn't stopped it, it would have populated the planet, and we would have had a new chapter. It just
indeed.
would have been without humans, and maybe there's no morality to that. But still, we're glad to see some of the distinctive people in this movie who are sketched really quickly and really well, I think, including sometimes science fiction gets kind of a bad rap because it's very male oriented, but there's a great female character in this movie who is very much involved in the action and who gives as good as she gets with the men and all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, she's in there trying to stop the creature just like everyone else when they're trying to set him on fire. So.
Yeah.
Does this film feel more like it's sci-fi borrowing from horror, or more like a horror film borrowing from sci-fi?
Yeah, I never know what that line of demarcation is. Like, is Bride of Frankenstein a science fiction film? Well, it sort of is. We know it as a horror movie too.
Yeah, right.
This one definitely feels like horror. It feels like we have a big monster on the loose, and that's one of the basics. But we're definitely in the space age with this setting and a flying saucer. So it kind of gets in, I think, as science fiction with all that going on.
Yeah.
So I'm cool with it being a sort of a hybrid. To use a scientific a term that our scientists might have used in their vegetable lab.
Right.
I'm all right with that.
Yeah,
and it is a.
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to comment, as you pointed out, it is in fact an actual flying saucer that we get in this one. To your comment about the origin of that description of what it might look like, this is what we have, this giant disc that's under the ice.
Yeah, they're going to stick with that flying saucer for a little while in movies of the 50s. Yeah, it's. I love the scene where they figure out that it's under the ice, and somebody says, "Why don't we fan out and try to figure out what the shape is?" And that's such a wonder. You can still, even at this distance, you can kind of get some shivers when they start doing that, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, it's a circle.
Yeah, right.
And I used to give a talk about these movies, flying saucer movies in particular, and I sort of like to think that vision of men creating this circle, a circle which has all kinds of resonance in terms of its metaphorical meaning, but also in this case, it means that we're looking at a flying saucer.
Yeah.
That's like the birth of 50 sci-fi right there. There were a couple of movies before this, but there you have this. It's such a wonderful image, and here is mankind set out to meet finally an alien presence. In fact, one of the characters says, "We finally got one." It's a flying saucer. He says the words themselves in that moment.
Right. Yeah, it's very different, and I think this is also interesting from what we had seen depicted as rocket ships that we might use to get like to the moon, like even in like Voyage to the Moon, as you brought up that film. It's like very different. I mean, they were very much rocket shaped, pointed as if going to be directed to that particular place. And so I think it's interesting that we're already getting kind of a differentiation from what we would use, the more pointy rocket to get out of here, versus what they would use, which is the saucer to get around.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah. A year or so before this, there had been one of the first serious sci-fi films called Destination Moon,
Right.
and
Yeah.
it's an attempt to be kind of like a hard science fiction kind of movie, and it's pretty fun. But yeah, as you say, it looks like a rocket, and that's what we would take, and
Yeah.
that's how we're gonna get there, and but there's no denying the kind of pop culture grabbiness of this idea of a flying saucer that got introduced in the late 40s. I mean, you hear the term and you can envision it, and it's like,
Yep.
oh wow, yeah, I could see that coming down and landing nearby. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
um, yeah,
It's so funny. Well, if the thing from another world is about containment through force and procedure, the day the Earth stood still pivots to an alien presence that arrives with a message rather than an attack. Also in 1951, Robert Wise's film is still one of the decade's definitive message movies. An alien visitor lands in Washington, D.C., and quickly becomes the focus of military panic and media frenzy. But his real mission is to deliver a warning about what humanity is doing with its new powers. This film, we have Klaatu here. I mean, he's framed as kind of a diplomat, but it shifts because he's a diplomat, he's a savior, he's a threat. You know, it kind of, we get a wide shift in his depiction. Does that matter that we're seeing him in so many different lights over the course of the film? Is that kind of the message?
no, it's always been a little bit contradictory. It's a really interesting thing about the film that it seems to be delivering a message of peace, or at least for peace, and yet it's got this kind of fairly strong-armed message that Klaatu is bringing, which is big. We will burn you to a cinder if you don't shape
Right.
up and stop screwing around with atoms. So that's always been a funny kind of mixed message, and I don't know how to resolve that, except that politics is and world events are very much on this movie's mind, and looking at some of the jockeying of the Cold War, and the United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other side, and that sometimes results in this kind of strong talk, was probably uppermost in the minds of the screenwriters.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I was just thinking about the fact that this is Robert Wise, who would also bring the first Star Trek movie to us in the theaters. I think that it's an interesting view of how we as a people adapt to something like this, or not adapt, but how we react to something like this. And there's wonder, but there's also some fear. And when there's fear and the person who is fearful happens to also have a gun in their hand, and whether out of actual a malevolent attack or itchy trigger finger because of something that Klaatu does, kind of creates this huge situation that pushes everybody into a place of, oh my God, they're here to kill us and everything. And it shifts the way that people think. And it takes such a small thing for that to be switched, right? Like okay, we think we can trust him to, like, oh no, he's not safe. He's going to kill us. He's got this robot that makes people disappear. And I think that's what's so interesting is the way that Robert Wise tells this story, where I don't know, it's interesting because I also, it's like, is it optimistic, or is it kind of like a film full of despair, because it's like, I don't know if we'll ever actually get to that place that Klaatu is actually wanting. And at the same time, is it feeling like they're trying to be too coercive with it, as with their message, as far as like, you will be killed if you don't stop. It's interesting. It's a fascinating film.
Yeah, it's proposing a way that the universe can be run, or the galaxy, but it's definitely there needs to be like this father figure who's gonna put the hurt on you if you don't stay in line. But our reaction, Earthlings, that the first thing we do is we shoot the guy when he walks out of his flying saucer and all that. That is certainly it's interesting. It does make the film less optimistic than it is a cautionary tale, where it's kind of showing us what we need to do better and what we could be doing better. And there are characters in the movie who are trusting, and there are characters in the movie who are skeptical and suspicious and ready to that scene where Patricia Neal's boyfriend is ready to turn in Klaatu once he's figured out where he is, even carries some resonance of the blacklist era and the period of people informing on their friends and colleagues in case they might be communists. So we see both sides. We see some hope and the goodness of people, but we definitely see that more. It's appropriate that it's in a kind of a noirish style with all the shadows and everything, because there is that pessimism or fear maybe that the movie is depicting, along with all the fun sci-fi stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it, because it feels like we're, as a species, I'll say, like too young and naive to fully understand the implications of everything. It's like maybe the scientist that Klaatu befriends has a better understanding of all of this, but as a species, as a whole, like we just can't get there. We're just too, we don't trust our neighbor necessarily. And so when it comes to that, it's just like we're just not quite there. We're not ready to live in Gene Roddenberry's, vision of a future. It's the like
Federation gets along. Yeah.
Right. It's a little too much for us. And so I think that's, it's a fascinating element, because then you have all of these institutions, you've got the government and the military and the scientists even, and then in Klaatu's world, you've got the robots that they've created to essentially lord over them. And I don't know, I have questions about how realistically peaceful their society is if they have to have these robots created to, that they can't control anymore, to forcibly control them. But all of these different institutions, like, are they meant to protect us? Are they obstacles we need to get around? Are they liabilities to our society? Like all of that stuff. I think the film, I don't know, there's some interesting assumptions in there, and I don't know if where Robert Wise stands, because the film kind of has that melancholic end as they take off, and we're just like left. Well, it's up to us now.
Yeah, it's funny that the film is so beloved and has been practically since it came out, but it is an open ending that ends with this warning. And most movies that are have such a long history of being loved are not open ended like that. But and you were talking about institutions, and this is a movie that mentions the United Nations. It must be one of the early Hollywood films to talk about the United Nations, don't you think? And I wonder if it's kind of trying to carry some of the spirit that must have been the early optimism of the United Nations, which has not carried on, unfortunately, to our present day. But it almost could be one of the many metaphors. Could almost be talking about, we need a United Nations. We need to be talking to each other and agreeing on things the way Klaatu wants us to do in the galaxy.
Yeah. The only other movie I can think of with the United Nations in this decade is North by Northwest, which of course ends in a murder. So it's not exactly the peaceful vision of it either.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
You were talking about the family tree of film, and so one of the interesting things about the genesis of The Day the Earth Stood Still is that in post-war Hollywood, there was this really interesting moment when the studios, which were still more or less at the height of their powers, decided that they wanted to make movies that were kind of do-gooder films, that were a little more grown up, that were trying to help the world change for the better. At the same studio at Fox, they made Gentleman's Agreement, which won the Best Picture Oscar in 1947, I think, which is a film about anti-Semitism in America. There are films about race, movies about people with disabilities, and for that 5 or 6 years or so, you have some really grown-up movies. And supposedly, this film started when the producer of the movie, Julian Blaustein, wanted to make a movie about world peace. Understandably, in the aftermath of the bomb and so on, and quite rightly recognizing that nobody is going to want to go see a movie about world peace with their family on a Friday night, pick science fiction, and you can get into those themes by putting some flying saucers in it and getting people to come to the theater that way. It's connected to that thread of these grown-up films that were kind of optimistic and trying to change the world for the better, and in this case promote a message of peace in an anxious time.
It's interesting that you say that. It made me think, not exactly the same context, but the way that the term elevated horror has grown in the last decade or two, describing kind of a shift in horror films to be, it's a serious horror film and it has a social message and everything. It almost makes me think that science fiction, starting in this period, could be called elevated science fiction. I mean, it may as well be. I mean, that's essentially what we're getting out of these films, is a more social message, trying to get a message, whether it's a message of world peace or whatever, across through a genre story.
Yeah, I think so. And in this film, you have as you do in The Thing, there are some references to the Cold War and to the Russians and those things going on. That when there's a scene early in this film when they're at that rooming house and where Klaatu gets a room and they're sitting around, and the woman at the table says something like, I know who these visitors really are. And she doesn't quite come out and say it, but she means commies, and you know that that's what she means, because she's listening to the radio too much or something like that.
Right.
But people like to talk about how these movies kind of embody the anxieties of the Cold War, and the fears of being invaded and fears of having your ideology taken over, possibly by the communists. In sort of disguised terms, but in this case, they're not even disguised. They're really, the movie actually mentions them and puts them out there and kind of acknowledges that all of this stuff is mixed in together. Our suspicions of the other are when it's an alien, it's kind of inextricable from our fears of those communists over there and what they might have in store for us.
Right, exactly. Well, speaking of fears, our next film definitely explores a lot of that. This is Ishiro Honda's 1954 film Godzilla, a film that treats the monster less like a novelty and more like a historical event. After strange disturbances at sea, a prehistoric force rises and heads for Japan, bringing devastation that the film frames in the language of disaster, trauma, and consequence. It's interesting because a lot of the things we were just saying apply to this also. It's not just a film that's a straight up monster movie. I mean, this is a film where Godzilla isn't presented necessarily. I mean, certainly they're trying to defeat him, but is he an enemy? Is he a consequence of actions that they now have to live through? Is he a warning that they need to listen to? It's in a different way. You could say he is a spin on what we just talked about with Klaatu.
Yeah. Is Godzilla a projection of our own desires, fears. Another monster from the id, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes here. But yeah, all of that's really true. If people haven't seen Godzilla for a while, the original Godzilla, this first movie, it's it's the same. You might think, oh, it's a metaphor for atomic age stuff. And maybe you might have forgotten that, in fact, people do actually talk about the atom bomb in this movie, and it is uppermost in people's minds. It's less than a decade since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so it explicitly does get invoked, and the movie doesn't leave you with much mystery about how Godzilla is meant to be. You can interpret it in a lot of ways, but clearly it's connected to our atomic age.
Well, and this is an interesting one because I wonder, like, there's something about the tone of this film. It's full of, it's a very serious film, and it's full of grief. We're dealing with, as you just said, like, these bombs had just been dropped on Japan less than a decade before, and just absolutely horrific just stories that came out of that, and just the way that lives were changed and completely ruined. And I think this film brings a lot of that grief to it. And I'm wondering if, like, a story like this, how much it really ends up changing what sci-fi means. Is this changing what sci-fi means for how Hollywood would kind of continue interpreting it from this point forward? Or is this a different tone that we, I don't know. I feel like we do get this tone coming out of the Hollywood system. I'm just trying to think if we're talking about it in our particular list of films, but this one definitely feels like the most serious and just a different feel for the sci-fi.
Yeah, it is definitely a grim movie, and a lot of science fiction at least attempts to have a certain amount of lightness to it, even if it's getting into serious stuff. But yes, this is a very fraught movie, and it helps that it's in black and white. And if you grew up on watching Godzilla movies, a lot of them have a kind of the sequels have a sort of a cheap look, and they're in color, and which somehow automatically makes them less serious or something. But there is something about the darkness of the visual image in this, as well as the material, that has the effect that you're talking about, I think. So it's almost, in retrospect, for me, it's kind of too bad that the subsequent movies got a little bit silly, and even more sort of kid oriented. Because this one is so, it's got those strange little cutaway scenes. That scene of the mother with her children sitting on a sidewalk and trying to console them. It's just these strange little vignettes that come out that really stick in your mind, along with the spectacle and the special effects.
Well, and to that end, it feels like this one we're really seeing it pull from war movies, like, and maybe not so much like what we were getting out of U.S. war movies during the war, but certainly like, and it's, I don't know, I guess the timing wouldn't necessarily work, but like with Italian neorealism and everything, we're seeing like that sort of shot of these realistic shots of people who are, suffering, and it's just kind of like these cutaway B-roll sorts of shots that we're getting painted a picture of, like, the trauma that people are going through after these wartime situations. And you can see some of that rubbing off on how they were wanting to depict it here.
Yes. And that it's making me think of something that Steven Spielberg said when he made his War of the Worlds version. It's been done a few times, including in the 50s, but he actually came out and said the quiet part out loud, which is that his film came out in 2005, and he was interested in exploring some of the imagery of September 11th in the destruction of his alien invasion, and the massiveness, the unthinkable, happening in reality, and he had to work through some of that and use some of that imagery. And I'm getting at from the way you're describing this movie, because it is post-war, it is post-atomic destruction, and so here's a crazy movie about a dinosaur that comes back to life, and yet those images of fires burning in the night and of buildings crumbling and of people bearing physical wounds sometimes on their skin. There's a few moments there in the beginning where we see that whatever has happened has burned people in a way that it's very disturbing and very resonant of war. There's no question that Godzilla wants to work through images and how we remember them, how we've survived them, but do it in a way that it's a movie, so it's safe. These are not going to hurt us, but we are drawn to them in some strange way.
Yeah, right.
It's a way of understanding our experience, even if it's a metaphor in this case.
No, very true though. What do you think the ending says about science? Is it redeeming? Is it like a sacrifice? Is it like an irreversible threshold that we can't, or that we have crossed?
You mean like the fact that this new device has been used to get Godzilla? Yeah. It's so fun. It's so interesting because that it does sort of seem like this is just my own reaction to it. I don't know what the filmmakers might have intended, but you do have that sense that once the genie's out of the bottle, that each time we make another invention to try to balance the scales, we end up screwing it up again, as we've seen so often in the environment. We try to correct something, and it makes things worse than it was before. So there's definitely a certain amount of ambivalence that the movie has about this device that's been invented by the scorned lover of our heroine. Yeah. But does that the way it plays to you? Do you think is that the?
I question, like, it's one of these things where I feel like it's just this inevitable path that we have now stepped onto because of this, where it's like, okay, we've created this horrible thing in the nuclear bombs that have now brought Godzilla back. And now we've created a new thing that has kind of cleared all of that up. But is that just the next step to kind of create the next monster that's going to come? And so that's kind of like, it seems like it's kind of this inevitable cycle that we have now entered into, is kind of how I read that. I don't think I walked out of the film feeling like, oh, thank goodness, everything's good now. It's a hunky-dory ending.
Right. Yeah. We're not throwing our fists in the air.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really true. That ambiguity really works in favor of the film. And there's so often with these movies, I can't remember if somebody made this observation, but the way that Godzilla is in the tradition of something like the golem in Jewish mythology, a monster who's created by the people, but almost by their will to come to life and do their bidding, except of course it can't be controlled, and so it goes, but that it also then even when it goes away at the end, there's always an implication that it will return the next time that it's needed, or that it's summoned, and Godzilla does kind of feel like that too, that's it's sort of a tantalizing idea that Godzilla is a product of atomic mischief, but also somehow we've collectively summoned him, or to do something. I don't know what. It doesn't seem to have worked out well, but that is how it always feels with these Godzilla films. Is like somehow we've accidentally summoned him, and it's really on us. Like it's our fault, and now it's the onus, and we have to figure out how to deal with it. So yeah. Of course, it's funny that in some of the sequels, Godzilla is the hero.
Right. Yeah.
He is actually on our side because there's some other threat that needs to be quelled or whatever.
Well, and yeah, it's interesting how it shifts so much and over the course of all the stories. Because I think by the time we get to all these modern remakes, I think isn't King Kong now the one who's on our side and Godzilla's the enemy? I can't remember how far they went on these recent ones, but it's just a whole crazy world that they've kind of continued.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But and this movie was this was a big hit. We should mention that whatever its resonance might have been, huge hit in Japan. It was an expensive film to make, but it made its money back, and then it played really well in the rest of the world too.
With additional footage, we should just mention with Raymond Burr added to be the scientist, right?
Hollywood got its hands. Yeah, it was splicing, cutting a lot of stuff and splicing in Raymond Burr, and that's a pretty funny version if you know the first one. Yeah,
right. Well, Godzilla made catastrophe enormous and public. Invasion of the Body Snatchers makes it local, quiet, and personal. In 1956, Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers takes place in a small town where something feels off in a way nobody can quite prove. The doctor starts hearing the same complaint from different people, that their loved ones look the same but aren't the same. And the film turns that suspicion into a full-blown crisis of trust. This is such a fascinating and excellent film, and one obviously that has a strong message that's been able to be readapted over several decades. What would you say is the core anxiety in this film? Is it communism? Is it conformity? Is it the loss of individuality? Is it social mistrust in general?
Well, I'm happy to kind of go along with the idea that it is about a conformist society, and that the people, that this is mostly the metaphor that's at work here. Because it worked so well in the 1950s. It has been left open, as you know, that you can take it as a cautionary parable about communism, as an ideology that wants everybody to be kind of at the same level, and that works. And maybe the movie's better that you can interpret it in different ways, that it's a little bit open, but. Sure. Yeah, for me, it's just the classic small town, and this idea that everybody ought to be the same and have the same ideas, and not have their emotions be too strong, and all that is it's hard to resist that the power of that idea played out in science fiction terms.
Yeah, right. The idea of the possibility of help. What is the film suggesting about that? Like, do institutions, are they stabilizing in this film, or do they make it worse? What do you think they're saying here?
Well, they're not very helpful once they get once they're taken over like everybody else, and it could even be argued that the institutions are built to run smoothly with people who don't express a lot of individuality or emotion. So it is a film of individualism, because we've got our characters running around trying to keep themselves, trying to find some sort of help, but not finding much at hand. They're trying to keep themselves human. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think? Is that a theme that you see coming out of that?
Well, it's tricky, because by the time we get to the end of the film, I feel like, okay, maybe institutions are our friends. Because the very end of it suddenly shifts into very positive territory, as suddenly this truck crash is revealed to be full of pods, and we're going to call in the military and everything's going to be saved now. And by the time we get to the 1978 remake, they've taken the much darker turn of the story, and so I feel like the institutions. I feel like I don't know. The way I read it is like institutions are designed to just kind of keep moving. And if something out of the ordinary happens, they kind of pave over it and just try to keep going because that's how institutions work. But they can change. It's just hard to get them to change is kind of the way that it seemed to me. That I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the framing story of this film is much. There's a long history about it. That it was shot after the rest of the movie was shot, so that it would have a more reassuring ending. And they did put out some decades ago. They did put out the non-framing story version, which ends with Kevin McCarthy shouting, they're coming, they're here. And that left you with absolutely nothing to hope for at the very end. So yeah, that's a funny kind of side note to that.
Yeah. What I mean, we're connecting a lot of this to horror as we kind of talk through these. This one definitely feels like we could, easily fit this into horror as well. Because it's like, is it the horror that you're going to be killed or that you're going to be replaced and nobody will notice, or that you might get replaced and not even notice yourself? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's like psychologically kind of horrific, is the idea that like when these people wake up, they act and seem like themselves. So is it so wrong? Like it's a fascinating line. And that's an interesting element with the whole nature of the conformity angle. And I guess you could also then say kind of the communist angle, is that like, are we giving up ourselves? We're still ourselves ostensibly. It seems that way. And I find that to be kind of a fascinating, and I suppose you could say kind of frightening, maybe dangerous way of what the story's exploring.
Yeah, it's cool that the people who have changed over and become pod people are perfectly happy.
Yeah,
about
right.
it, and they know what it was like, and they have embraced this. And I don't know if there are four versions of the story, which has its basis in a really quite a good novel by Jack Finney. One of the things that I find kind of funny is that by the time you get to the most recent one, which came out almost 20 years ago with Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig, the thing I don't think it's a very good movie, but the thing that struck me about that version was by the time you get to the end of it, you kind of feel like, okay, it's enough. Humans have had our run. We've had violence.
Conformity is the way to go.
And hatred and everything else for thousands of years. Let's just get out. And the movie almost seems to be sympathizing with that, whereas the previous versions, of course, were on the side of staying human and with all of our flaws and everything. That level of despair had come in by the time we get to the 21st century that it might not be worth it anymore. But Don Siegel, the director, he said this was he made all kinds of different movies, and he said this was a really important film to him, that he felt like, he said somewhere, I see pod people all around me, and I just really wanted to say something, about that.
Interesting.
And the movie does have it really, you were setting it up as a kind of a change from the spectacle of some science fiction movies to this world, which could be happening in our world, right? That's part of the appeal of Invasion of Body Snatchers. It's a normal small town, and if you didn't just occasionally see a pod under a table once in a while, everything looks really, really ordinary, and that works. That works so well. I tend to like that kind of science fiction where the science-y part of it is necessary for the setup, but otherwise you could just be talking about ordinary people and maybe not even see the sci-fi aspects of it at first glance, but they're there, and they're somehow all the more sinister for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, like that feeling of paranoia seems to grow over the decade. And like this film for me is kind of the one that feels like kind of the turning point where we start feeling a little more paranoid as things go, and watching how our doctor here is kind of like trying to figure this out, and just kind of like the fear of just not knowing like who to trust. And I think we'll end up seeing that over a couple more films as we kind of go through our list. But I think there's a big part of that. And I believe, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Don Siegel actually came out at some point and said, oh, I wasn't doing anything about communism. I think it was more just that conformity angle for him. I just think it's very convenient that it also feels like you could argue that it's, the story of they're already here. Like, you might not know that your neighbor is a communist, and that's the scary thing, right?
Yeah, you could play it that way. You could interpret it that way. I'm also thinking about, the thing that you said earlier about how we're pointing out of the 50s and toward the 60s, which becomes this completely turbulent and explosive decade. And I wonder if Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a movie that kind of sets us up for that transition, this critique of a conformist society, of a society that had gone too far in the direction of a certain kind of blandness and agreement, and pressure to have everybody be happy and complacent. And that if that's pointing us toward the 60s, which is going to reject all of that and be much more concerned with letting the freak flag fly, and all kinds of other things. But I do wonder if the generation that grew up watching these science fiction films would become that 60s. They would embody that 60s revolution. And you do have the movies. The science fiction movies are kind of pointing them in that direction in a way. If we do accept that this film is a critique of what we think of as the 50s in America.
That's a great point. Yeah, absolutely.
There's lots of other. Well, we're going to talk about a movie called I Married a Monster from Outer Space, which also gets into some of this kind of stuff. It was probably a ripoff of Invasion of Body Snatchers, but I'm encouraging people to become members so that they will listen to that part of it, because it's a great subject, I think.
Great movie to talk about for sure. Let's shift our conversation to The Incredible Shrinking Man, which brings the crisis down from one ordinary body or down to one ordinary body and one ordinary life getting smaller and smaller. Jack Arnold's 1957 The Incredible Shrinking Man starts with a simple accident. A man is exposed to a strange mist during a boating trip, and soon he realizes his body is literally getting smaller. What begins as a medical mystery turns into a surreal survival story, and then something even more philosophical. We were just talking about Freud and the id with the last film, and now we're getting into philosophies and everything, which I think we could also argue Forbidden Planet certainly deals with philosophies about what we're seeing with science fiction and creatures that are much more intelligent than us, potentially even God, like that sort of thing. And here we are in this sci-fi story about a guy who starts getting smaller and smaller. And I think what it talks about, and what I found so interesting, is that we're getting a story not just about, the science of a person actually shrinking, but it's a sense of, and this I think ties into 50s conformity, it's a sense of perhaps his authority as a man shrinking, diminishing, his masculinity, certainly, as he starts feeling like a child when he's around his wife, the meaning of life, the certainty of existence. I was honestly, I had never seen this film before, and I was completely surprised about how deep this film got, especially by the time we get to like the last scene. Like, this was a real surprise for me of a film that it's one of my favorite discoveries from this series.
Yeah, it's really kind of an amazing film, and it does great things, because it does give you some of the wonderful effects that we want from science fiction, and some of the what ifs that we get from that, but also everything that you just said. This interesting look at masculinity, especially of the '50s variety, and nothing less than our place in the cosmos by the time you get to the end of it, and another open ending in a way, even though the film is it's kind of a perfect ending, but it also leaves you it's just slightly open.
Yeah,
So
very much. Yeah.
yeah, it's a kind of a beautiful film, and we should say that it started as a novel by Richard Matheson, who would be very successful and much beloved writer of fantasy, and wrote some Twilight Zones that were very memorable, and just a really imaginative writer.
I Am Legend. Yeah, lots
I
of
Am
great
Legend,
stories.
one of his longest lived properties.
Yeah.
So there's just a great deal of thoughtfulness in it, and it is it's kind of the panic of personality and who I am and what is my place in the world, and it's done in such a way so that it's so brilliantly vivid that I'm in the basement, and there's a giant spider, and it's made so physical that it really brings it all very much to life.
Yeah, and I mean, even though it's just supposed to be a common house spider on its web, but clearly it's a tarantula that they're using. It's like, okay, yeah, all right, I'll buy it.
Yeah.
I'll buy it.
Yeah.
But what I think is so interesting is how there's an element of this film being science as a cautionary tale, right? I mean, we don't know what the mist is. Was it nuclear radiation? Like what was it? It's just this thing that he happens to get sprinkled with as he goes through it. And then I think it's kind of missed often, but he also mentions the reason that it happened, the whole shrinking, is that he had been, I can't remember, driving somewhere or walking somewhere and accidentally got doused by somebody spraying like bug spray on someone's yard. And once the combination of those two things hit, suddenly that's what causes the shrinking. And so I think that there is an element, and maybe it's just kind of like as things, and I honestly, I didn't look into it, but like when did the government start creating more regulations with some of these science things to make sure that, we weren't getting, killed by these pesticides and whatnot. But it does make you start thinking that people are thinking about these things and like the realities of all of this stuff that's out there that could potentially affect us without us even realizing that we've been affected. And I think that's a fascinating element that is pretty terrifying.
Yeah, I like that part of the film, that science fiction must perhaps now grapple with things like pesticides. The atomic threat is huge and unavoidable, but what about this other thing that's so much more mundane, and that allows us to have our nice lawns in front of our white picket fence houses, and the vegetables that we eat but might also be killing us. And this is it is another film that presents that world of the '50s of a comfortable, seemingly conformist community and society, and everything in place until one thing goes wrong, and then you see it start to fray and start to fall apart.
Yeah. And it just doesn't end. There's nothing anyone can do to stop it. Like once people have figured it out, because I mean, that was another element I found interesting, is that science gets involved, right? Like they go to the doctor, they end up at like a science institute to try to figure out what this is. And there's a point where they think, okay, well, we think we stopped it, but we can't reverse it. And then they didn't really stop it. He does keep shrinking. But I think that's fascinating. Like and that's another element, like the whole element of the media being brought in, and everybody is like, hounding this person, and they want pictures of him and all of that. And it kind of creates this sense that there are things that are just completely out of our control. And we want to, we'll try, we have all the best people trying to figure it out, but it doesn't mean we're actually going to be able to solve it.
Yeah, it's funny you brought that up because sometimes with this film, I have found it very moving from the perspective of someone who has a chronic illness, which I do, which it's not a life-threatening thing. It's actually a condition of the inner ear, but it has made my life unpleasant sometimes. And that feeling of kind of hoping that it can be made better or it can be made to go away, and it can't. You can do all of the right things, just as this guy does in the film, but it won't save you, or at least it's not going to cure the thing that is troubling you. Is so different from the usual sort of Hollywood version of storytelling, where we do expect some kind of happy ending, or we expect science to come through in the end. But no, you can be kind of going along and living your life, and then this a spiral can start happening to you, and there it is. And the movie is kind of amazing in capturing that feeling. I
Yeah.
must say, from my own experience.
Oh yeah. I'm curious, how do you read the ending? Does it feel bleak, or is there a sense of liberation when you get to the ending?
And not bleak at all. Yeah, it's quite beautiful, and it has that sense of transcendence. And it's not that I'm an expert on Eastern religions or something, but even if you're a casual a reader, you can kind of get that a little bit of resonance of this feeling of acceptance, not it being delivered to heaven or hell, but of being a part of an entirety, and that he has finally, in some ways, the movie might be about his journey toward realizing something like that,
Yeah.
and accepting it. And we live in a world where people don't like to accept things. We deny death in lots of different ways in our culture, and in our thinking and in our religions sometimes. And here's a movie that brings you to it, and says it's fine. He sounds ecstatic at the end, the way we imagine some Buddhist monk
Yeah.
reaching some sort of happiness at the level
Right.
that he's aspiring to. So yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
You just watched it for the first time. I mean, what was going through your mind when you were watching the film and realizing, oh wow, this is the ending that we're going to get?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was like this moment of transcendence. Like you see something like, you're thinking back to like my Wuxia series with like was it a touch of Zen that ends with him sitting on the mountain and he's got like the glowing gold coming from his head. Like he's reached a state of enlightenment. And that's kind of what it felt like with our character here, is like he's finally, by diminishing to the point where he's now like at the end, like not to spoil it for people who haven't watched it, but he's the size of a speck of dust out in the grass, and is, as far as we know, as far as he knows, just going to kind of continue shrinking. And there is something when he has that moment of realization at the end that, I'm as big as everyone else. And it's like, that's the moment that's just like, wow, okay, this is like, I mean, Day the Earth Stood Still was a message movie, but this is like a message movie, right? Like this was actually really saying something very touching and human. That, I mean, it really struck me.
Yeah, there's people who can be comforted, and I guess I'm one of those people who can be comforted by the thought that we are just infinitesimal specks in the cosmos, and that coming to terms with that and accepting it is actually a liberating thing, and,
Yeah,
and not fighting it, not picking up the giant sewing needle and trying to kill the spider or whatever, but realizing what we're a part of. So yeah, it's so amazing. And of course, there are stories that the studio wanted to have an ending where they found a cure and he was restored back
Yeah.
to whatever it was. Um, Luckily, the people who made the film put their feet down,
Yeah.
and it's so much more effective for
Oh,
where it takes us.
absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So jumping back into how this film kind of influenced later, like the genre as it kind of continued after the 50s. When you look at the 50s and what it left behind, what would you say are the through lines that you really see as the ones that are clearly defined that show up in other decades later?
I mean, some of them. Sometimes you can compare them literally because so many of these movies were remade.
Oh,
So
that's, yeah, right.
it's kind of easy to compare and contrast, I suppose. And you know, the, of course, I'm thinking of The Thing, and it gets a remake in the early '80s that is closer to the original short story. So it's a slightly different plot, but ends up
Well,
with a much more pessimistic
yeah.
kind of conclusion, for instance.
Well, but I think that's an interesting one too, because I mean, you could take that and even stuff like The Fly, and you could see the evolution from the iterations that we've just talked about to where body horror really starts going, because it's much more special effects oriented, much more gruesome, and anything that's involving kind of transformation, like that becomes like what the effects teams really celebrate and get to play around with. So I think that's, I mean, an interesting offshoot of where we were here and then what they were able to do once they had the effects tools to kind of continue playing around in those body horror sorts of stories.
Yeah, yeah. The effects technology and also the more permissive standards. There was
Yeah.
enough censorship still in place in the '50s that there were places that you couldn't go. And of course, by the time you get out of the 1960s, you can almost do anything and show anything. So that can become more explicit too.
Would you
Yeah,
say that? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say that while so much of the '60s and '70s stuff does seem like it becomes more cynical,
Hmm.
and perhaps rightly so, then there's always the pendulum always swings, and I'm just thinking of the ways that when you get to the 1980s, maybe in the wake of the Spielberg Lucas visions of more peaceful aliens or more of a sense of fun about space travel, a lighter tone in the Star Wars world, um, that there's the 80s. There's a little bit of a sense of a return to the '50s in a way because that American society was once again conservative and going in that direction, and science fiction is there to send up little missives of complaint or questioning. I'm thinking of like John Carpenter's film They Live, which is an incredible movie to come out of the Reagan era
Yeah.
and was intended by Carpenter to be a sort of response to that, and it has this. It's one of those great examples of science fiction being able to use its genre to comment on things and to criticize,
Yeah.
and maybe there's a little bit of a parallel there with the '50s. I don't know. Yeah, so what's one stray thought that comes to mind?
Well, I think that, yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, if we're going off the elevated horror and calling these elevated sci-fi, I think that, yeah, you can see that thread of kind of these social allegories or whatever, messages or whatever they're doing in these science fiction stories, but using them to kind of explore bigger, bigger things. And I think that's often the case that you get here. One thing that I was wondering is like, I mean, the '50s is such a decade of kind of the paranoia and everything that you would get from the Cold War, and that we've talked about in a number of films. And I mean, I shouldn't just. It's not just science fiction that's full of paranoia. There are plenty of stories that are full of paranoia in the '50s. looking at doing a series on film noir and hopefully a series on 50s paranoia thrillers. But I can't help but think that some of all of this paranoia that we're seeing in the science fiction here leads to things like the 70s paranoia thrillers, which is, that's kind of like intensified and even a greater exploration of all of that. Like, I mean, I think that Invasion of the Body Snatchers seems like a perfect lead-in to those sorts of stories.
Yeah, particularly since the remake of that in the 70s, which you mentioned earlier, fits into some of those paranoid political thrillers of the 70s. It sort of goes hand in hand with the increasing sense that in an America where our illusions had begun to fall, and post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, the post-revelations about the CIA and civil rights and whatever, that our reasons for feeling paranoid seemed more justified in the 70s, and so that does indeed get expressed in popular culture. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I love the way that the 70s version picks up on all of the coloration of that moment of post-Vietnam and
truly,
and even the 70s. I mean, the fact that the character played by Leonard Nimoy in that, which is another funny pop culture reference, is sort of into this kind of self-help pop psychology thing, which was very big in this. That was one of the 70s ways of people trying to sort through the world and this new world that we were in, and that easy kind of "I'm okay, you're okay." It's kind of
right.
psychology, and that too. It fits in so well to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and the way that there's an urge to fit in or to be happier.
Right.
All that stuff. Yeah, works. It does indeed work very well.
Do you see today, I'm just curious, like looking at where we are today in science fiction, I'm just curious, like what threads do we see today? Like, are we seeing any sort of invasion or replacement type of stories? Like, has that thread continued? I mean, we talked about The Invasion, that remake, the fourth remake or fourth version of the story that came out 15 years ago or so. But I mean, do you still see that? I know Steven Spielberg at the time of recording has a new movie coming out that I believe is about an alien invasion. But I mean, is that still a thread?
Well, I thought it was really striking that so many of the 50s films were getting remade post September 11th. The Invasion,
Day the Earth Stood Still.
Day the Earth Stood Still with Keanu Reeves as the alien. Almost all of that British film, Attack the Block. I don't know if you've seen that one, but that's a wonderful movie. And they all seem to come out in a kind of cluster there. And you do have to wonder whether it had to do with the inflamed fears of being attacked ourselves, even on our own homeland, and whether that starts to get expressed. I don't know.
Even The World's End tackles conformity.
Yep. It was funny that they were all kind of bunched in there for a while. I don't know if I don't know if I have you noticed that still with that scenario, because it did seem like we transitioned to the more what took over, of course, in the movie world was the success of superhero movies and the Marvel universe and any other universes, and a more triumphal version of science fiction was suddenly to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, the only one that's coming to my mind is the one with I'm trying to remember her name, but it's called I'm not even going to remember what the movie is called. No One Will Save You, I think, something like that. It's like an alien invasion film that really has very little hope. It's a woman who's completely isolated and all alone, living in kind of this house by herself, and then the community doesn't like her, and so she's completely isolated, and then she has to figure out how to survive this alien invasion all by herself. It's Caitlin Dever who plays in it, and it's called No One Will Save You. So I don't know if you had seen that one, but like I just wonder if that's kind of where we are with these stories of like there's much less hope, you know. And again, you could call that elevated because in the process of the invasion, she has to face her own history and her own past and everything. So it's definitely kind of like a mental health story. But but I other than that, I can't think of that many.
Yeah. There's also the one with Julia Roberts, which the title of that is escaping me too, that came out a couple of years ago, which I think was a Netflix thing.
That's. But is that an alien one, or is that just like everything, like all of our phones and everything, like technology just completely stops? I know exactly what you're.
Yeah, is that what happens? Yeah, it's left kind of ambiguous what's going on.
Yeah.
That in a way, that scenario of disaster has sort of seemed like it supplanted the alien invasion fantasy of some large scale disaster going on, whether it's something like Contagion, the Soderbergh movie that seemed to predict COVID-19 in certain ways, or other big disaster films. There seem to be a lot of those. And then, of course, we've gotten distracted a little bit by, it's not a distraction, it's a source of interest in science fiction, but artificial intelligence has allowed us to, movies like Ex Machina, which is a really interesting treatment of an AI character, and our willingness to identify with or anthropomorphize that figure. Those have been pretty interesting. Those AI movies.
Yeah, I just thought of another. Go ahead.
No, maybe that is what we should be thinking about right now. Perhaps as an audience, that's the thing. But yeah, what
people are curious.
Did you remember?
Well, I just remembered Arrival is another very strong alien invasion film. It's not an invasion, but it's an alien arrival film, and I think that's an interesting one that speaks to what we saw all the way back to like Day the Earth Stood Still, is like that first contact of our species with their species in some capacity as a form of like moral test, and how do you approach them in a way that isn't going to just be read as a threat right out of the gate, and so and then of course there's a lot more to that story, but I think that's another interesting example of where we are with these sorts of stories. So yeah, I mean, you look at like just modern science fiction, aside from the alien invasion stories. I mean, we've had plenty of stories about mutation and contamination. I mean, we just had I don't know if it falls into science fiction, but we just had a reboot of Toxic Avenger show up in theaters last year. We've had plenty of post-apocalypse sorts of stories. And so, I mean, I think that you can definitely see the threads of what how the 1950s changed science fiction, and I think that's largely what we're still trying to explore with a lot of the stories that we tell now in that world, in that entire genre.
Yeah, and even your question about how do we feel about the mad scientist character? What is the movie saying about him? That does remain a source of interest, and maybe it becomes one of those characters that we acknowledge we need that person out there doing crazy things in order for science to continue, while at the same time we seem to want to punish that figure too for going too far. That does seem like an evergreen that's not going to leave us. Anytime there's a Frankenstein story that is on the horizon, that's always going to be there, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, suddenly Dolly the sheep pops up, and that's like everybody brings up that whole idea of like mad science, and these people have gone too far, and what are we doing? And every time a new AI tool comes out or something else, people are like, oh, it's all Skynet, and so it's like all those comparisons, and I think it's just been burned into our psyche and our the zeitgeist of who we are right now, that all of these things are things that are just always in our heads.
That's absolutely true. And as long as we have people, the movies have their own man scientists, and James Cameron is one of them, and we can all Guillermo del Toro is one of them, and as long as they're going to be, no wonder they're drawn to stories about those characters, I suppose. Because they're doing exactly the same thing, and we want to see what they come up with next. So we're responsible for creating monsters too.
Great point. Yeah, we're feeding into it all of these different monsters. We're telling them what we want, and here it is. So, well, I mean, it has been a fantastic conversation, Robert. Thanks so much for joining me for all of this. I mean, it's a lot of material covered over the course of it, for sure.
Yeah, it's a wonderful subject and a wonderful period, and it's been fun. It's been fun thinking about some of these movies and American culture at large too.
If people want to, want to learn more about you and what you're up to, do you have some places online that we can send people to look?
Well, I have a simple WordPress blog that I've had for many years, which you can find at roberthorton.wordpress.com. Actually, if you're interested in Frankenstein things, I wrote a book about Frankenstein, mostly concentrating on the 1931 film, but also just the idea of Frankenstein and why we are attracted to that idea, and some of the sequels and remakes and inspirations that have come past then. So that's if people are into this thread that we've been talking about, maybe they didn't enjoy. The book is published by Columbia University Press. But yep, I'm still a film critic and still out there writing, and we're gonna see movies this year. I don't doubt that are going to give us just as much to talk about as we've been talking about here. It's always the case.
Absolutely. That is very, very true. Well, I certainly appreciate you joining me. So once again, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Andy. Good talking to you.
Next month, I'm staying in the same post-war aftershock, but shifting genres. I've been building kind of a loose mini-series on how World War II reshaped film style by changing what stories felt urgent and what kinds of threats movies could imagine. We've looked at post-war westerns and now 1950s sci-fi, and next up, we're shifting into 1950s domestic melodrama, a cycle studios often marketed at the time as women's pictures, for better or worse. If sci-fi externalizes anxiety into monsters, invasions, and mutations, domestic melodrama pulls the pressure inward into love, marriage, ambition, class, reputation, and the cost of being seen a certain way. Join me next month for 1950s domestic melodrama. Thanks for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Network. Music by Orcus. Find us and the entire Next Reel family of film shows at truestory.fm. Follow at The Next Reel on social media. And if you're enjoying the show, please leave us a rating and review wherever you listen. As we part ways, remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious.